Jet Moto 2, otherwise known as Jet Rider 2 in other regions, was released for the PlayStation in North America in late 1997 and released elsewhere in early 1998. And like its predecessor, would also be a futuristic hovercraft style racing game where you race around a variety of land and water based courses, where your ultimate goal is to compete against other opponents on each of the tracks and to become the overall winner as you race through many different championships and tournaments. The game does also give you access to a variety of multiplayer and split screen modes to play against your mates, and was considered to be among some of the most popular in the series, which presented 3 games on the PlayStation. There were other games that were in development later in the series but were cancelled due to lack of sales or poor sales with regard to the third entry, Jet Moto 3, as that game was a complete overhaul of the original 2 games with a new graphics engine, had a different gameplay physics and control features, and it just felt and played very differently compared to the previous 2 games. If anything, it actually felt like a worse type game. It just didn't feel the same way. It felt completely different from everything else that was seen in the series before, so which led to its low reviews. But the first 2 games in the series did fare much better, as they were also developed by Single Track, that were the creators of the Twisted Metal series and even Warhawk. Unlike the previous entry, this game would give you a lot more access to its tracks pretty much from the get-go, whereas in the first game you had to complete tournaments on the higher difficulties from normal all the way up to the harder difficulties in order to unlock all of the tracks, whereas in Jet Moto 2 you could gain access to them pretty much straight away. In saying that, there is a vast diversity in terms of the tracks that are available. You have anything from ground and sea to like volcanoes, forests, even winter style tracks where you've loads of jumps and crevices and pitfalls that you have to avoid, because if you fall off at any point you're respawned at the last checkpoint, which means you have to play catch up the whole time. So it can definitely leave for a lot of frustration in the game, as it is quite competitive but also very difficult. The one thing to note about this game is that the tracks, while many of them are decent, they do try some very obscure ideas where the tracks are completely broken up into different elements that are literally just, in many cases, just sitting in the air, which in many ways doesn't make a lot of sense. And it can also lead to the frustration, because in this game, with most of the courses, you literally just can't race at full speed, because if you do, you will go flying off the track more times than you can count. Whereas in the first game, that wasn't really a thing. This game, like the third entry in the series with the tracks, because they were trying to do a lot of obscure ideas, some of the tracks in many ways just felt unfinished. And this type of concept would continue on with the third entry, and even with some of the prototypes that was in development that would later be cancelled. I have made a video on one of the prototypes, which I will leave a link to in the description, and you could definitely see the unusual processes that were being put together with those games. While the ideas might seem good on paper, but those type of games, I think with the control systems and everything that was going on at that time, it just made the games feel very unfinished, and this would result in the game's reviews, because even with the sequel, while it was larger than the original with more tracks and more features, it was also noted that there was a lot of obscure elements that just frustrated a lot of players. It wasn't so much to do with the graphics, it was the overall gameplay. While it was fun and had the same kind of markup and style of the original, but it's just with the track layouts and the unusual features in the game, with having to make sure that you time jumps, because in some cases if you were going too slow, there were certain jumps that were up higher than where you should have been when in terms of having to make a jump, and if you weren't hitting it either at full speed or at a certain type of speed, you wouldn't make the jump, which means you could end up falling to your death and having to respawn many times over before you'd actually get one good run at it. But by then your opponents have already passed you and the race is already over. So there was a lot of trial and error. Like I said, the game, it felt like kind of like it was rushed. It felt like it was put together, and this would continue on with the future sequels as well. This type of idea was there, which it's not to take away from the game. Clearly they had their ideas and concepts, but I genuinely think that during the testing phases of the games, they seen these things and they completely overlooked them. They could have done more to make these games a lot more accessible, and even the tracks, they could have been just better laid out. The tracks are definitely the main gripe in this game, which is a pity because it is a vast improvement over the original in many ways, but it's even more flawed in other ways too. So that was the problem really as such. And again, with the third entry in the series, the game would be developed using a completely different visual style. The control system was completely different, and it also had the same gripes. They never really kind of changed that dynamic. Even with some of the prototypes, like I've mentioned, It's like whoever was designing these games, they were adamant that they were sticking to these unusual styles. It tried to go for a futuristic, almost apocalyptic style element where the world was completely decimated, where nothing is as it seems, everything was just destroyed, so you had to race within the confines of derelict and just messed up environments. But I think it just could have been better put together in terms of the way it was going to favour the control systems of the vehicles you were racing as. I know it sounds like I'm hating on the game, really it's not. There are some really cool features about this, and it is fun to play in short bursts, especially on some of the tracks. You can definitely get a lot of fun out of it, but there's just certain tracks in the game that will just drive you absolutely crazy. It's there to be seen, you can't avoid it, especially when you get into the game further. And it's funny, I think that was the start of the demise for the series. While the second game was probably considered the best in the series, it also started that trend that would inevitably kill the series off, which is a pity. The game, however, was rebranded later on as it was resold under like a more budget entry series, but it also added in some more distinctive elements that provided a few extra features to kind of try and deal with some of the conflicts in the original release that would have went under Jet Moto 2, the Championship Edition. But I still feel it didn't really flesh out the flaws that really were apparent in the game, unfortunately. Now, it's not to take away that it's a bad game, it's actually not. These series are decent, especially the first two games. If you've ever played them, they are a fun experience to be had, especially if you're playing with the multiplayer elements with your mates. But if you're playing competitively, especially in the single player mode, that's where it can cause a lot of frustration, because like I said, later on when you get to some of the more intricate and weird track layouts, it's hard to really know what to do, where you're supposed to be, and then the fact is that a lot of it is trial and error and luck to be able to hit certain jumps and to hit certain pieces of the map, because everything is all spread out, like where you have to hit massive jumps, and again, like if you don't time it right, it will lead to your demise, and it's just pure luck as to whether you'll get a good run at it, which is not really a good way to really play a game. It shouldn't be just dependent on pure luck. You should be given some accessibility to at least to allow you to use your own skill in order to do that. Now, there's people out there that would have been able to do it, but that's the problem, is it's only catered to that type of player that has those specific set of skills. But for a casual gamer coming into this that wanted to enjoy it, you'd end up just not bothering after a while. It would just throw you off, which is a pity. They're definitely a series of games that had great promise, but just were let down by just silly decisions, I think, in terms of the level development more than anything else. Now, it may not have appeared like that at the time, but I genuinely think that it definitely could have been better. Now, that's just my opinion, but it's plain to be seen. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I can't unsee it, and if you have played it yourself, I'm sure that you will understand it too. Like, I genuinely don't like to hate on games. Like, there are positives to this game, but there are also a lot of negatives, and it's easy to see why. And it would be the same idea, especially with the third game, as it's more noticeable, it's more apparent, because the control systems are a lot more fidgety and twitchy, and it feels like a completely different game to the first two entries. It doesn't even feel like the same game at all, which I will cover in a future video. But aside from what I think of the game, I would love to know your thoughts of what you think of this entry of the Jet Moto series, and what do you think of it overall. So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other types of futuristic racers like this that were also released on the PlayStation, that document many other interesting quirks, then you can check out some of the other videos here I have on screen, and even some more videos that I covered previously on the channel that show a lot more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.